And we are now recording. So hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome. I want to introduce our lovely guest today. This is Dr. Daniella Vinitski Mooney. She is a peer-reviewed, published scholar and conservatory-trained actress through the NYU Experimental Theatre Wing and the Royal Academy in London. She is also an award-winning director for devised work and multimedia. Her areas of expertise include experimental and classical theater, as well as new work development. Daniella most recently dramaturged, I love that word, for Playpen, and has taught regularly for the University of Pennsylvania. Her work has been published with Routledge, Theater Survey, Ecumenica, Bloomsbury Press, Theater Journal, and Theater History Journal. Her book project, Field of Mars Revisited, The Immersive Theater of GAle GAtes, is a descriptive narrative of the Brooklyn-based theater company written through the lens of the avant-garde and is recently contracted through Routledge. Daniella holds dual Canadian and American citizenship and currently resides in Philadelphia, which is where she's coming to us from. This is what's so exciting. So I'm going to mute myself now so that you can take it away, Daniella.
Okay, fantastic. Well, it's really delightful to meet you all virtually this morning. And Karen, thank you so much for having me. This is very exciting. I'm clearly and extremely passionate about experimental theater and this company in particular. I created this very extensive PowerPoint. I'm guessing that we'll only have time to go through about half of it, and I'm hoping that we have time to watch a very obscure clip, one of the few remaining video archives of this company. And if time allows, I'll cross into the strange story of that as well. So what I thought I would like to do is actually begin to talk about GAle GAtes and experimental theater at large, and to some degree theater itself through a theoretical lens, and that being the function of the theater. Very generally speaking, from a Western lens, when we look at the history of theater, we begin with the ancient Greeks, and they essentially give us a lexicon for how to disseminate and understand the purpose of theater in society. And the theory, which may or may not be true depending on your own personal take, is that ancient Greek tragedy teaches us empathy. And through the use and vehicle of empathy, we become stronger citizens and a better democratic nation as a society as a whole, whether that's global or more central to wherever you're located. And that's sort of the running thought, the Aristotelian thought with Greek tragedy. When we look at experimental theater, there are novel ideas as to its function. And I'm very fond of a lesser known scholar that I discovered over my research named Richard Constellanets. He has a book that is fascinating, completely underread, not really known at all, not unlike this company, right? Structure informs meaning, so that's very interesting to me. And the book is called Theater of the Mixed Means, which is basically his own terminology for experimental theater, which has been alternately called interdisciplinary theater and now has this very hot buzzword of immersive theater. And they all have their own different nuances, but that was his terminology. And it was based on multidisciplinary work coming out of 1960s, 1970s New York, and he was interviewing all these radical artists. It's a great, great resource if you're interested in diving further down the rabbit hole. So in his book, he basically talks about the function of the experimental theater as educational, and that it's paradigm shifting, and that through this polyliterate expansion, in terms of sound, where in the theater experience, there's not really a hierarchy. It's not necessarily character narrative driven, which we get from Aristotle, but rather sound is a form of a character, space is a character, and so forth. We engage with the performance in such a way that our minds are expanded, and we may even have a meta-reflexive experience. We may even learn something about ourselves through this abstraction, and so essentially leave the experimental theater space a transformed person, and that can be an intellectual event that is also visceral, that is also embodied, and through that the heart. And in that way can create a sort of empathy, one could argue. Dr. Gautam, Gautam Dasgupta, who was a mentor of artistic director Michael Counts with GAle GAtes, has this premise that Michael's work and GAle GAtes was highly democratic, and he used the phrase it increased democratic spectatorship, which very similar to Konstolanyc's ideas, is the notion that you have a very individualized journey, that there's this great abstraction given to you within the performance space, oftentimes which was an immersive promenade event where you walked through it, not unlike a gallery exhibit. And so it would be up to you, neurologically speaking, to connect those dots. And within that connection, the how of that connection, you come to your own self-discoveries. Perhaps a memory is arisen, maybe it manifests this obscure philosophy that you didn't know you had possessed. And again, there's this really wonderful revolutionary aspect to it. And the democratic aspect of it, I think, to me, is that you gain ownership of your own individual perceptions. And this is something that you can enter dialogue with other audience members. And so you leave the space a more fortified and cohesive being. A last theorist that I'm just going to touch upon is somebody by the name of Jacques Rancière. I don't know if you've encountered him in this class or other coursework, but he has a chapter from Artform called The Emancipated Spectator, which is essentially the same concept, this idea that engaging with abstract artwork via the visual form or the performative form allows a freeing of the mind and the spirit. And in that way, again, you become a more wholesome and complete individual and citizen. So there's definitely this through line, arguably, of theater functioning as a way of fortifying individuals and creating a more complete being, which is part of a larger whole, a larger democratic whole. And then I'm just going to geek out for a second and say that also, if you look at radical governments that have tried to stymie the theater making process, particularly in Russia, 1920s Russian avant-garde Russia, you see a very large pushback from theoreticians and artists who are talking about the political power of the theater, even when it is entirely imaginative and radical and strange. So I would invite you, if you haven't already through this conversation so far, to just reflect on a time in your own lives where you may have experienced a paradigm, what I'll call a paradigm shifting encounter with art. In any form, whether that be dance or theater or the visual arts, which certainly invites that through its openness and non-literal nature. And if you don't have an artistic bent, which is completely valid as well, maybe just a time that you communed with nature so that you have what I'll call an embodied experience relating to the lexicon I'm presenting. So essentially my thesis with GAle GAtes, which the research supports, is that it was entirely paradigm shifting. It was extraordinarily novel and a very, very unique and important contribution to the theater history trajectory. I'll conclude with the Marvin Carlson quote that was in your reading as well, that basically speaks to GAle GAtes as being an essential forerunner to the immersive theater movement, which is such an incredibly hot and popular phrase today, which in some level is very open and in other ways is not. And I think is a little bit, in my perspective, and gently speaking, I feel gets cheapened because it tends to be used in every regard. And so it's very exciting to have unearthed this company and their unique contribution through the immersive theater framework. So they call themselves Gaga now, for shorter, who was GAle GAtes? The company name was actually named after artistic director Michael Counts' grandmother, who was a painter. And she was influential in everything that he did. And it was a great supportive force. And as you may have taken from the reading, and certainly in the discussion today, you'll see that the company was very much informed by visual artist sensibilities. In terms of who they were, their mission was to create provocative, radical works. They were all young and creative, and they wanted to infuse it with this fresh appeal. They were certainly very visually driven, and they were very interested in site specificity. That was a core tenet of their works. And they were obviously very physically driven, as the chapter reveals, and interested in spatial experimentation. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to flip to share screen, and I created a little bit of a slideshow. As I mentioned, we might not get through all of this. So I'm pressing from beginning, and I'm hoping it starts. Aha, okay. So you read a little bit about their 4 major productions within their 40,000 square foot warehouse space in Dumbo. Previous to that, they had been traveling all over the world, primarily Asia, and doing primary research into Buto dance, which is a Japanese form of dance that arrived out of World War II and has a consequential, eerie, nightmarish, melodic. I don't know if the word would be melodic. There's an elegance to it, sadness to it, a grotesquerie to it. And that was the form that they were studying that really infused the visual aesthetics of all their productions. When they were eventually given their 40,000 warehouse space in Brooklyn, it was largely because they were just getting exhausted of making outdoor work and they wanted a home, right? I mean, it's a very sort of, so Marlowe, the psychologist, there's a psychologist who talks about the essential needs of humans, and a home, a shelter is one of them. And that through that lens, this theater company had arrived on some level and they needed a home. The Willentis were a father-son development team who loved art, and Dumbo, down under the Manhattan Bridge overpass in Brooklyn, was pretty crime-laden, relatively abandoned, and they wanted to unearth the potential of the landscape. And so they gave Michael Campt and his company this enormous warehouse space for $1. And there were a lot of rumors around the time floating around how they were able to get this space, because for performance, for artists, and certainly theater artists, space and rent are 2 things that create a lot of conflict and desire, because you need space to create the work that you have. And the trade-off was that the company had to make the Dumbo space, the Dumbo area, a cultural beacon for these developers. And it is now, they were true to that promise, and it's now considered to be a mini Soho in New York. So this first major piece that happened in the space, which you read about, was Field of Mars. It was essentially a rumination on Nero's Rome and the burning of Rome seen through the lens of hedonistic New York. It was a promenade event. We walked through the space, and it was a lot of technological invention. Walls would open up and you would be seated, and then you would be guided away from the proscenium area. It would be like this false proscenium. So you'd be seated, you'd think this is, your expectation as an audience member was this is what you're going to experience for the duration of the show. And then all of a sudden, boom, this enormous cavernous space opened up for you to essentially float through with other audience members. So this was, this particular moment was a still life scene, essentially, in this living room scene. And the walls opened up in the back, and there was the dominatrix, as you can see. And I believe that red wall behind her has opened up later as well. And in terms of the visual drive of the company, you can see Matisse's Icarus in the back, which to my recollection was later 3-dimensionalized within this roaming, strange event. Here's just a close-up from the piece. Dr. Beth Kurchin in the left, a colleague of mine from the Experimental Theatre Wing, Ben Bush on the right, play these sort of film noir, dance-driven characters. And if anybody knows the actress Cynthia Hopkins, a remarkable solo performer, she played some sort of fairy pixie character in the back. And this is the moment when the final wall opened up and there was a magical forest, essentially, quote unquote, according to company members, for the audience to walk through. In terms of the intersectional or engendering of the arts, there were a lot of remarkable artists that were drawn to GAle Gates of every type, whether they be composers or dancers or visual artists or sculptors or actors. There's an enormous downtown following. And one of the visual artists that was most supportive of the group, and there were many, many prominent artists that wanted to see them succeed, was somebody by the name of Craig McPherson. And Craig was on the National Endowment for the Arts, which is the largest grant giving center in America, because we don't have federal funding. I mean, the way that the artists are treated in America is a true travesty and I hope to have time to get to that a little bit. And in any case, Craig McPherson was an NEA awarded artist. He had sat as a curator on grant committees, and he loved GAle Gates, and he had an exchange. I don't quite know what the word is that I'm looking for, like an agreement with the company where he could sit in on rehearsals and he would make these dynamic, strange paintings, as you see here, inspired by the production itself. And then, to my understanding, he would oftentimes sell them for big bucks and then give that money to the company. He would also help them with networking, invite them to parties with big name people and so forth. He was a really wonderful advocate of the company. So this is one of his works inspired by Field of Mars. The third production, which you read about, Tilly Losh, was actually inspired not by Tilly Losh, an actual true-to-life figure. He was a famous ballerina of the 1930s, but this Joseph Cornell box sculpture of the ballerina of the same name. And here, Tilly Losh, the ballerina, is seen attached to a balloon and floating off into the beyond. And artistic director Michael Counts created this very lovely, enigmatic piece that was also considered to be immersive, although the audience did not walk through the space. And to my estimate, looking at the archives, watching these rare archives, it was very much a piece about Americana, speaking of America, Americana nostalgia, Americana icons, and also this a certain romanticism and aspiration, almost desire to just float away from one's troubles. There's also a critical thematic integration of the black and white film Casablanca, if you know it at all, which I don't really talk about in the physical dramaturgy chapter. And because the archives were lost, I'm not really able to revisit it and talk in greater depth about the Casablanca influence. But according to artistic director Michael Counts, Tilly Losh was basically, it had the inner logic of a dream, and it gave one the sensation as if you had watched Casablanca and fallen asleep. So it's a very conscious, surreal quality to it. In terms of the visual arts driven component, here we see Beth Kirkhagen again in the World of Christina, and this is a three-dimensionalized recreation of Christina's world, a very famous painting by Andrew Wyeth. And so Christina was a true person. She had tragically been struck by polio as a child and was paralyzed. And in this particular moment, Christina, as I interpret it and as communicated to me, is not so much straining, but you see this visual, physical difference between herself and home as shelter versus nature as shelter. When Michael Count integrated Casablanca into this production, the semiotics of an airplane became very important. So you would have the sound of an airplane flying through the sky periodically, and that became integral to, I guess we could say, the dramaturgy of this character of Christina, and that she herself was sort of poised, waiting for this airplane to appear, that it would differentiate the actress's relationship to her character in some way. From a dramaturgical geeking out actor perspective, this is really unique because we talk about Stanislavski training and having objectives and motivations and so forth. And as you may have read from the reading for Beth Kirkhagen, her relationship to the character was not motivation driven or objective driven, but really sensorial and just living within that space and being true to the nuances of it. According to lighting designer Jeff Boyd, who's worked with some very big names, both in musical and theater venues, who had also been launched from GAle Gates, this particular moment took about 7 minutes of stillness as the lights shifted to reflect sunrise. This is a still from the archives, and in the distance, you can see a reference to Cornell's Tilly Losh, the ballerina floating away in the balloon. Actress Cynthia Hopkins was in fact linked to this balloon as communicated to me. And I don't recall if I saw it or if it was communicated to me or not, in terms of where and how the balloon moved. To my memory of it, the balloon actually moved towards the audience. And so you had this incredible, spectacular, grandiose intersection of these two visually driven arts worlds, right? Because the visual arts create worlds within themselves. I feel like the word softening really comes to mind more so for myself, and whatever meanings you arrive from in this integration of these worlds is valid. You know, going back, or it's theoretical because we're not in the live audience space, but however you imagine you might have experienced this, and whatever personal revelations you come from with that, I think are lovely and to be celebrated. For myself, I think it just underlines again this sense of desire, this very gentle wish to just float away into the ether in a very beautiful way. I think there's almost a mystical quality to this moment, at least. 1839 was the third major production in the space, and if we have time, we're going to see a little clip of it. It's very strange. They're all strange. This one had a little bit more of a narrative flow to it to some degree. According to the company mission, 1839 was about the invention of the camera. I think that's a really interesting assessment. That's not what I necessarily would have come away with, but what that tells me is that this piece is about identity and about fixed identity, such as the photograph, versus fluid identity in this, because versus fluid identity, such as when one looks in the mirror and is moving around, or a reflection might want to see in the water. And I come from that image because it's literally placed within the production itself, where various characters look at themselves in the mirror frequently. There is a major character in this play. He's actually a mannequin, and he represents a boy who later turns into an adult. And so for Michael Counts, this piece was about maturation and moving from boyhood to manhood in a very fragmented, dark, eerie, and difficult world. And the world itself takes place, as hopefully we'll have time to see, in something unlike our own reality. It's very, very macabre. This particular moment is called Still Life. Kate Moran is the actress that's featured. She's now a very famous Parisian actress and recently performed in the lead role originated by Lucinda Childs in the 2012 revival of Einstein on the Beach. Einstein on the Beach is a landmark production in the experimental theater trajectory, if you're familiar with it. And these puppets were done by somebody of the name Manju Chandler. So Long Ago, I can't remember, aptly named, is a reimagining of Dante's Inferno, which I think I write about briefly within the chapter. And it was essentially a 12 installation promenade through the space. According to company members, it was the crowning achievement of the production. I myself did not see it. For this production, Michael Counts confessed that he himself was not a playwright. And so he found and collaborated with somebody, by the name of Kevin Oakes, who was an emerging experimental playwright who worked predominantly in Soho and major venues. There's more that I want to say about this particular piece, but I'm not quite sure in the moment. It was the company's final large production, and so it's quite wonderful to me that they essentially left on a high note. There was one final piece which I'll get to as well, but that was more of an installation heralded by Michael Counts. And here's another Craig McPherson image taken from his rehearsals of this piece. What I did want to say very briefly about So Long Ago, I Can't Remember, is that there's this this whole conversation started with a bunch of little technical glitches, and it seemed so odd and also correct. It made sense that would happen when talking about GAle Gates, because the archives surrounding GAle Gates similarly would sort of manifest and they'd be available, and they were thought extraordinarily rare. And then I would discover through my primary research that in fact, there are many archives available and I would have access to them, and then they would just disappear. And an example of this is that So Long Ago, I Can't Remember, drew a young talented filmmaker who wanted to document it. And that archive has apparently just disappeared down the rabbit hole. Nobody knows where it exists. I just very briefly want to break down the resident model of the company. Something that was very unique to them was that they had two visual artists, Tom Fruin and the late Michael Anderson. Michael Anderson had actually been hoarding these rare archives in his Harlem collage shop out in New York where I met him. He found the VHSs when the company closed, and he opened up the shop. He was a world famous, I mean, he still is, but he recently passed, unfortunately, collage artist. And he had all these empty beer bottles and liquor bottles and 5 stacks of VHSs. And I was, about to leave the door, and he goes, "Oh, maybe you'll want to borrow these." So I'm very much indebted to him. So Michael Anderson and Tom Froon were resident artists. They were basically given free studio space, free tools, all the time in the world. To my understanding, they actually used their studio as an apartment space just so they could focus on their own artwork. And the trade-off was that they had to create these remarkable visual sets that Michael Counts conceived. Jeff Sugg, you may have read a quote or two of his, is considered a genius engineer, technical engineer for the theater. He's worked on Broadway, and is now in Philadelphia. And Joseph Teebs was a keystone of the company, and he was their resident composer. This is a picture of Michael Counts from that time, and I just love this picture. I mean, for me, it represents the time on so many wonderful levels. It's raw, and it's elegant, and it's cool, and it's full of potential and edge and punk. And I think that it's a wonderful visual symbol of the company itself. I just want to conclude because I feel like I may be nearing the end of my time. I know that this quote was in your reading, but it's such an essential quote. It basically anchors the importance of the company and their contribution to theater history in a way unlike any of the research that I discovered. So through my research was largely based on what we call primary research, which is going out, finding people, interviewing them, visiting archives, visiting the space, and having interface with as much residual information as I could from a primary first person place. And within that, I reached out to Dr. Marvin Carlson, and he, to my understanding, is considered the primary singular, I don't know if singular, but I'll say singular theater scholar in the world. And he works out at a CUNY in New York, and he was so kind to respond to my emails. And this particular quote is what gives GAle GAtes the gravitas and importance from a historical viewpoint that nothing else could. So he shared, looking back from the perspective of the second decade of the 21st century, what strikes me most is how much GAle GAtes anticipated the aesthetics of what is now called immersive theater, and which has become a major commercialized aspect of the contemporary performance avant-garde. GAle GAtes was the true modern innovator of this approach. And what is so remarkable is that despite their high downtown following, despite later grants from the NEA, despite later shining praise from the New York Times, nobody really knows about this company, and they essentially folded into obscurity. This was largely driven by their site-specific mission and the warehouse space itself. I don't have time to go into the slides, but they were dealing with strange columns in strange places within the warehouse, multiple ramps, random steps that led to nowhere. And they reconfigured their productions and utilized and exploited space in every way that they could. And this was something that simply could not tour. According to a wonderful scholar who helped me through this journey, they basically flew and died by the weight of their genius tied to the site-specific mission. I have a lot more to say, but I think it was probably best to stop here in terms of time. And Karen, do you feel that there's enough time to watch a clip? And is that something you all would want to do?
Oh, I think that's a good question. How long is the clip?
It's about 5 minutes.
Yeah, I think we can watch it. I think, why don't we watch it? And while we're watching, so why don't you stop screen sharing and I will start screen sharing. And while I'm doing that, start thinking about some questions that you have. I think this is really a great opportunity for everyone. So let me, and you can just put them in the chat now. Okay, share screen. And Let me go to here.
So this clip is from 1839, and it allows us a real sense of Joseph Deeb's contribution from a musical perspective. I think probably more so than anything else. And the immersive quality of this is more so from its total art perspective, this idea that every sensory factor, every sensory component of this production is available to us. So it becomes almost like a sensuous, I don't know, I retract that, but it's strange and loaded. So I'm curious to people's experience of the clip.
All right, let's see if it works.
You stand over there, and you, when the window opens, you jump, okay? Okay, it's okay. This is a pretty time, these seasons, unlike others maybe. Each season I say that now the time has come and no one will do anything. One day a young boy left his house and went walking in the woods near his family's home. A walk he'd taken many times in a place he'd known all his life. Only today it looked different. Today it seemed foreign. And today he felt a little lost. Today he walked as if he'd never been here before. He walked farther than he usually did, and longer than he usually walked. He didn't know that he didn't. Hello? Hello? Is anybody there? Is anybody there? He didn't know that he had been gone much longer than usual, and it was beginning to get dark when he came upon a clearing. When he came upon a clearing where there were a few remaining stones of what he imagined had been a temple.
Oops.
Oh, that's a great question.
If only there were full moons sometimes.
You know, it's really the tragedy of ancient work that's pre-digital. We just don't have these great archives. Like I hear so much about these wonderful, like Marvin Carlson talked about this particular production that he saw that was full of like hundreds of blue umbrellas. And I asked the company, and this is Marvin Carlson saying that it was one of the most memorable productions he's ever seen visually. You know, somebody who's seen work around the world is considered the global expert. And when I asked the company members if they had any photos, they were like, no, we just didn't think to do it. It was pre-digital. So I think we saw that in this particular archive as well, where it's just not good quality. And I apologize, but I hope they were able to get a sense of what that world of 1839 was.
So where would the audience have been positioned in that?
So that was actually a proscenium production. Tilly Losh and 1839 were proscenium productions. And what the company did within those productions was actually play with the space itself through reveals. And also they had some very unique design. I can't quite think of the word because I'm not a techie. I don't have that gift. But as you may have noticed, the character of the Anna Barkin played the very large sort of Elizabethan / Greek god monster character with the batons. She slid towards the armadillo, and they had these particular flats that were considered to be so mechanically ingenious for that time that the Wooster Group, if you're familiar with the Wooster Group, they're an iconic company name out of Newark, would come visit the space and ask how it was done. So it was this kind of playing with space and expectation that was available in Tilly Losh and 1839. And in terms of how is that still immersive theater, Marvin Carlson actually defines immersive theater later in his interview as total art, basically the Wagnerian Gesamtkunstwerk, if you're familiar with the phrase. And this idea that there's a whole entire sensorial experience that the audience member has. So it's not necessarily contained to just promenade.
All right, I mean, this is fascinating. Thank you, Daniella.
It's wild.
Great if we can get to some of these student questions, which I'm really excited to hear. Those of you who have put questions in the chat, do you want to come on and ask yourself, or do you want me to ask them?
I wouldn't mind either way, to be honest.
Okay, why don't you go ahead?
Okay. I mean, yeah, thank you for that. I found that really, really interesting. I sort of said it in the question in the chat, but I was wondering, like, if these sort of performances will be a lot more impactful for the audience, and sort of being allowed to have some agency and sort of like explore the space and being more open to interpret what they're seeing will have that impact on them. But is that sort of a two-way thing? Can the audience in an immersive production sort of shape the performers to a greater extent, or is that more just they're more affected, but for the performers it's sort of the same process as it would be for a sort of proscenium play?
Oh, that's a gorgeous question. And I did see that in the chat. So thank you for asking that. So I have a couple thoughts. My first thought is that it's probably case to case, depending on the aesthetic and directorial vision of the production itself. And in most cases, I imagine that it's rather tightly scripted from a choreographic lens, where people have to get to a certain point in the space within a certain time and so forth. And I don't know, but as actors, you know, and whoever here is an actor as well, an essential part of the training is improvisation, so that if there was some sort of unexpected interface with the audience, I imagine that the actor/performer would know how to work with that and adapt to that. My other thought was that I wish I'd written it down because I actually have it for that. But my other thought was that it's so wonderful, and I so greatly appreciate that you bring attention to the audience's body and space, because I think, personally speaking, as a somatic performer, as a somatically trained performer, that is a body-driven performer, that this physicalization of moving through the space and the literal decision of where and how to move and when is part of that internal democratic process from a very micro perspective. And that's also what allows there to be a deeper ownership of the thought process, because you're literally guiding your own journey. And that's something I did not speak to earlier, and I very much appreciate you highlighting that. In regards, circling back, in regards to your question about how the agency of audience members could shift production, my intuitive response, and actually the experience I had when I had the privilege of seeing Sleep No More, was that I think it changes the experience for other audience members more so than shifts the performers themselves. Because I think there's more unexpectedness if a person crosses in front of you, or if you overhear somebody speaking, or somebody's breathing behind you and so forth. I think that can inform the production in different ways. So I hope that answers your question, and thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, that definitely answered the question.
Wonderful.
Mark, do you want to ask your question?
Okay, yeah. So I kind of have a history with Punch Drunk, which I hadn't realised would sort of come back round 22 years later.
Amazing.
It was one of their creative associates was my neighbour in university. They put together an immersive piece that was to bring an audience around a maze and slowly pick them off almost and send them back outside of the theatre space unexpectedly, until there were quite a large number of unhappy people. And so the plan was I had to get the actors out of there in case it turned nasty, and it actually did. I was just wondering if there are any other, because in the southwest of England, it isn't exactly a cosmopolitan space to have an immersive theatre production necessarily. It's whether there have been any other productions like that where it's not a dialogue with a member of the audience, it's actually things really didn't go to plan in the production, and what the process was for managing that.
Oh, that's so wonderful. We have a phrase in the theater called spectacular failure, when things don't go according to plan and we have to adapt. And I think that those kinds of experiences are sometimes very covert within the company members themselves. So that's a wonderful question. Should I follow up with them that I would ask? I would say I have a few different answers. I would say that most of the people that came to see the Dumbo shows were either akin to family. I mean, they were the downtown New York experimental community was relatively small, dynamic, but small. So it was, my sense is that they brought more of a party atmosphere. And my understanding is that these productions would often blend into really, the word heinous comes to mind, but I don't think that's the word I'm looking for, but raucous parties, wild parties, post and festivities, post production and post exhibit. So I think what it really probably did was deepen the community bond, is my sense. And there was also a very large global following. A lot of international people would learn about GAle GAtes because it had more of an European aesthetic. So I don't know, I'm certain that those moments happened, and I don't know that of them offhand. However, two glaring negative things did happen. One is the actual breakdown and collapse of the company. Michael Counts apparently was offered a commercial opportunity, and he, like many company members, were just tired of impoverishment. I mean, some of them were dumpster diving early in their GAle GAtes career, now world famous, but at the time were essentially homeless had it not been for the studios and the eateries that would just give them free food, which is a whole other conversation about sustainability. And apparently Michael Counts had jumped on this other opportunity, and company members kept showing up and not seeing him, and it was just a very difficult, painful time that a lot of company members describe as akin to a devastating divorce. So I think there was a betrayal. So I think the ugliness was actually within the company itself in the sense of betrayal and its dissolution, as opposed to audience responding, wickedly within the productions themselves. What I will say is that Michael Counts shared with me that an extraordinarily famous New York Times critic by the name of Ben Brantley, and this is actually the down low. He shared the name, I took the name out, I'm sharing it with you now. He's a premier critic of all the Broadway shows, or he was, had said to GAle Gates' publicist that Michael Counts needs to be taken out onto the street and shot for the work that he's done. And he never even seen a show. And that's what he literally said. He needs to be shot in cold blood for the work he's doing. So it wasn't really audience members, but the critics that were remarkably scathing. And there were a few others as well, but that was probably the worst of it. The last thing I'll share is that I also interviewed a company called Pig Iron Theater Company. They're an Obie award-winning company here in Philadelphia, and they do have a few stories similar to what you've asked. So if Karen permits, and if you'd like, I can just send those transcripts your way for fun, because they didn't make it to publishing.
I'd love it.
Cool.
I have a quick question for you, Daniella, that I think would be of interest to everyone. So you're both a researcher and a practitioner, right? And I think that's really interesting. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about the relationship between those two hats that you wear.
Sure. I guess it would make sense to compare it to the immersive audience theater going, where you have this embodied perspective, this historical perspective that informs and guides your impressions. I could identify more strongly as a practitioner, but I've just been more involved in scholarship recently. It has to do with domesticity. I have children, I have certain life circumstance, and I was just, all these wonderful calls came into my purview that I felt like I had to respond to. And I very much identify as a practitioner scholar who focuses on performance as research. So for me, they're really never separate. The unfortunate part is that in America, and I really seem to be down on American, and we started this conversation about Canada. I have a dual American Canadian citizenship. I lived in London briefly, other areas of the world, but America has a very, in my view, corporatized, categorical viewpoint on things, and you're placed in a box. You're this one thing or you're the other thing, and it just, people are not always able to allow two things to exist simultaneously, the way that you do have that larger sensibility in Europe and other areas of the world. And so it's funny that you mentioned that, because it's an identity that I personally struggle with. I think it certainly informs the scholarship and makes it better, because I have an experiential understanding of it as opposed to a theoretical one.
Fabulous. Izzy, did you want to share your experience?
Was this a question for me? I'm sorry.
Izzy wrote something about going to an immersive production at the Fringe, but I don't.
Hello?
Oh, are you here? Yes, you.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, my microphone's been bust. I was just saying that I went and saw this amazing production of Train Spotting at the Fringe, I think in 2018. And it was just mental, because basically it opens up and the audience members were lining outside, and basically it's like you're entering into a club. So they gave you wristbands, and then we all sat down, and I was just saying, in response to the first question with regard to audience participation, one of the audience members decided to get involved with the show, and my friend had seen it the day before, and she said it completely changed the entire narrative and the dynamic of the actors, which was so interesting, because I think what's really exciting with immersive theatre, I mean, more so with GAle Gates, it's spatial exploration, but when it comes to actual interaction with the audience, it creates a whole other perspective, and it almost changes a narrative to the performance.
Absolutely. And there's actually, thank you for sharing that. There's actually a journal that came out about a year ago that's specific to site-based theater, and it looks at it from an ethical viewpoint and the role of the spectatorship as well. So if you are all interested, I'm happy to forward that information along. That's really cool. Thank you for sharing.
Do we have any other questions? I know we're just about out of time, but if we have any last question that anyone wants to ask?
I have a question. I've actually got a few, but I'll just stick to one. So I guess I was wondering about the relationship between the opening kind of talk you gave about anti-hierarchical art and like democratic theatre and say like the experimentalism of GAle GAtes as a kind of performance and the relationship between experimental art or experimental theatre and its democratic kind of relationship to the public, or how might there be a tension there as well in terms of the transference of meaning being kind of difficult to understand with something experimental and people might be put off by that. And yeah, I was wondering if you could comment on that.
For sure. I think that there are experimental artists there which, to quote other company members, approach their work with this type of a laziness where there's so much ownership of their own narrative that they don't necessarily have a concern for the audience's experience and the kind of meaning that they have. And for Michael Counts, he literally says that I would always reach a hand out to the audience, proverbially speaking, that it was important for them to have an encounter that was meaningful. And so he would have their experience in mind. Earlier, we talked a little bit about dramaturgy, which I haven't really unpacked. It's a very all-encompassing word. And largely speaking, it's about the structure of a piece, whether that's a piece of performance or a play that's getting developed, or the research that a director needs to inform, let's say, a historical piece. And so I think that, to answer your question, intentional dramaturgy is really a keystone of what kind of meaning an audience member can arrive. So they certainly have to do the work if it's abstract, but a well-intentioned, I don't know if the word is ethical, but a company with integrity is going to integrate dramaturgy into their work. They're going to allow for certain thematic stepping stones, whether that be visual or sensorial or, fill in the blank, that an audience has available to them as a tool that they can use towards creating their own meaning. So for example, in Tilly Losh, you had this constant sound of the airplane and this image of Casablanca that was integrated with these other obscure but repetitive visuals that were given to the audience, and it was up to the audience to grasp meaning through that repetition. So it's really a sense of, I think there's like a poetic quality really, that and through repetition that can allow meaning to emerge. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you.
This has been absolutely fascinating on the whole. I was on the edge of my seat. Honestly, it was so different from actually anything that I know, and I loved it. I hope we can all say thank you very much to Daniella for joining us today. I am very grateful. Thank you, Daniella. And I will catch up with you soon. And thanks, everybody. I'll see you tomorrow at our anti-racist reading group.
This is really lovely. It was a true gift. So thank you so much, everybody. Feel free to reach out if you have any follow-up questions. And thank you, Karen, for having me. Thank you so much, everybody. It was a true joy.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.